So welcome everybody. Super excited to be here with you. We're going to talk about Team Topologies and Docker engineering. Team Topologies is a book which provides a practical and adaptive model for organizational design and team interaction. And at Docker engineering, we've been applying it and we are pretty thrilled about it. So that's why we're going to talk about this today. The talk is in three parts. We're going to talk first about the book and what it contains, how we've been applying that at Docker, and then Matthew and myself and Shawn will be having a short Q&A between ourselves. So, but first we should be introducing ourselves. So I'm GL, the VP of Engineering at Docker, and I've been working with Shawn.
Shawn Axsom, I'm a Director of Engineering at Docker. And Matthew.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Skelton. I'm the co-author of the book, Team Topologies. So just a little bit first then about the book, Team Topologies, published in September 2019 by IT Revolution, the home of loads and loads of really good books in this space. So it's about 2.5 years since publication. Now, the book has been described as innovative tools and concepts for structuring the next generation digital operating model. It's a collection of things we can think about, things we can use to help us run our organizations more effectively. First off, though, why do we write the book? What are the kind of challenges that we wanted to address by writing the book in the first place? So many organizations find that kind of flow of value is blocked. And in particular, they also find that the software that they're asking teams to work with is far too big. The software is not team-sized. It's way bigger than one team can handle. And yet we're asking teams to take on responsibility for building and running these kind of systems. In lots of organizations, there's lots of different kind of options for organization design, and the intent behind those decisions is not very clear. And many organizations end up being surprised by changes in markets or changes in the operating environment. This often leads to a situation where we're pushing against what's called Conways Law. Conways Law is effectively a kind of socio-technical mirroring where the communication patterns in the organization tend to shape the architecture of the systems that we're building, and vice versa, actually. Teams end up being pulled in lots of different directions because there's competing priorities, competing stakeholders, this kind of thing. Ultimately, because there's no clear kind of principles for deciding how work should flow through the organization. This tends to lead to disengaged teams, people and teams who are not really committed to what's going on. And then a new CTO will come along in a few years and do, oh, we need to do a reorganization and fix everything. But that reorganization typically is not driven by, it's not very well informed. It's certainly not driven by principles of flow. And so that reorganization doesn't really fix anything. If anything, it makes things worse. So what we wanted to pull together is a set of principles in the Team Topologies book that start with the team. We take a team-first approach. What would it mean if the team was the smallest group of people, the smallest unit, if you like, of delivery? Instead of looking at individuals and assigning work to individuals, what if we assign work to the team? What happens in that case? So then we can use things like Conways Law to inform our architecture and inform how we set up teams to relate to each other. In the Team Topologies book as well, we've defined just 4 types of team. We'll look at those in a minute or two. 4 types of team that have different kind of properties and different purposes, if you like. And that in itself provides a lot of clarity to organizations that are adopting this approach, because it helps us to reason more clearly about intent and purpose for different teams in the organization. One of the key aspects in Team Topologies that we write about is the idea of a team API. So API, obviously a technical term meaning application programming interface, but we're applying this to a team, a group of people, because we want to kind of like specify the ways in which we should be able to interact with this team. The reason why this makes sense is because we've got Conways Law at play, this mirroring effect. So if we can have an API for a piece of software, let's think about the API for the team as well, because we're expecting a high degree of mirroring between the two. If we put these things in place, we end up being able to move to a position further down the road where the organization itself can start to sense its environment, can be a bit more adaptive. We can expect to evolve what we call the topologies, the interrelationships between teams. We can expect to evolve them over time, and we're explicitly expecting to need to change how the teams are set up. And that's what Team Topologies is partly about. It's not a set of static team relationships. It's about being able to adapt. We're expecting flow to improve because of the changes to our teams and architecture. And ultimately, we're seeing that people inside the teams are much more engaged, happier teams effectively as a result of this. And that's the deliberate thing that we wanted to pull together as part of Team Topologies. These graphics are from the graphics we've just seen are from an infographic you can download from our website, teamtopologies.com/nutshell, and you'll find the whole diagram there to remind yourself. Some key ideas that we wanted to address then in Team Topologies are the need for a rapid flow of change. This is essential for kind of modern organizations who are using software enhanced services to offer some things to customers or to users. We need to make sure we've got a rapid flow of change. But that's not the only thing. We need to make sure that we're listening to what's happening from the production environment, from how these products are being used, and bring that information back into the organization, into the teams that are building these systems, so they can improve it really quickly. If we want a fast flow of change, we need to avoid handovers from one team to another, because handovers kill flow. One of the worst ways one of the most extreme ways of avoiding a flow of change is to have lots and lots of handovers from different teams, effectively because it introduces many different queues. And so this kind of traditional approach where we've got development, test, transition, BAU, IT operations, whatever, this handover approach is incredibly crippling from a flow perspective. So we need to get rid of it. And so our starting point in Team Topologies is what we call the Streamline Team. This is a team with end-to-end responsibility for a particular service, application, part of the landscape. And there's no handoffs at all in there. They have that end-to-end responsibility. They build it and they run it. They get the telemetry from live, bring that back into their awareness inside their team and improve the product. And this is the starting point because there's no handoffs. So this is, if you like, the kind of ideal, almost flow optimized kind of way of arranging the work. Now, this team is limited in size in terms of number of people. Most organizations find it's up to about 8 or 9 people. Some organizations with higher trust can get larger numbers than that. But certainly what we find is that for various reasons, anthropological reasons, really, because we're human, we can't really have that team bigger than about 15 people. This is what we see in sports teams. There's very few sports with more than 15 people from one side on the field at the same time. And that relates to trust and being able to work together very effectively. So these are very small teams, probably up to about 9 people. And they need to be as independent as possible. They're long-lived. We take the time to build them up. We don't just create a team for 3 weeks and then dissolve it. We keep that team together for a decent period of time. The personnel in the team might change slowly over time. So every 6 months, we might get a new team member and someone might leave. We take the time to rebuild the trust inside the team. But that team as a concept lives a long time. And so they retain the domain knowledge around this particular area. They become invested in building this thing and serving customers and meeting those customer needs in a way which is most effective. We're not just moving from one bit of code to another and dropping a few features here and there. We build a deep understanding of what's needed in that particular domain space. And that's all fine. And if that team then needs to learn some new skills to retain its independence, then it can learn some new skills. If it needs to take on some more details of say, technology, maybe some new ways of working with data or infrastructure or something, that it can take on that expertise. But clearly at some point, that team is going to reach a kind of capacity that there's going to be no more cognitive space effectively to work with, to retain their independence and work with all these different technologies. They've reached the limit of their team cognitive load. And that's a key concept in the Team Topologies book that we introduced. And so to help manage that cognitive load while still allowing a fast flow of change, we actually introduced 3 other types of team. And these 3 other types of team are key supporting teams for the Streamline team. The first supporting team is an enabling team, shown in purple. That's a team of experts in a particular area. It could be all sorts of things. It could be data, it could be continuous delivery, it could be containers, for example, experts in how containers work. It could be experts in machine learning, all sorts of things. It could be experts in legal compliance. Nothing to do with technology really, but some expertise. And the enabling team is there to help increase the skills and awareness in the Streamline team so that the Streamline team can continue to be independent and have a fast flow of change. The enabling team might work across multiple Streamline teams over a period of time and detect that all of these teams, or many of the teams, have the same kind of problem. They're all really struggling with machine learning, or all really struggling with some kind of container as a service solution in a one cloud provider, whatever. And they go, oh, that's really interesting. Can we, as an organization, come up with something which simplifies the lives of all of these teams when they're working with this particular technique or this technology? So the enabling team is sensing what's needed across multiple teams. What can then be provided potentially is some kind of service or improved experience for these streamlined teams. And the two team types that help to provide that improved experience are complicated subsystem team, shown in orange, and particularly the platform team, shown in blue at the bottom of the diagram. Complicated subsystem team tends to focus on a very specific algorithm. So maybe video processing or some kind of really awkward calculation that's not realistic to ask a streamlined team to work on. So we're taking away the cognitive load there and asking the complicated subsystem team to do it instead. The platform team has a much wider remit, working on all sorts of things that are not really related to the streamlined team's main focus. Typically speaking, we find platforms around things like design, data, infrastructure, that kind of thing, which are not directly related to the main kind of customer focus of this streamlined team. And so the purpose of these three supporting teams, enabling, complicated subsystem, and platform, is to help accelerate flow in the streamlined team whilst reducing cognitive load. So it's quite an important kind of very different perspective on different types of team and the mission and purpose of different types of team in an organization when we're thinking about fast flow of change. So team types are really important, have different behaviors and purposes, but it's also really important to have different interactions between teams. So just like in any complex adaptive system, the behavior of the whole is determined by the interactions of the actors, not by the individual actors themselves. So in Team Topologies, we define three what we call team interaction modes. Collaboration, which is two teams working together for a defined period to achieve a specific outcome. So it's quite a narrow definition of collaboration. Collaboration can be quite expensive. Collaboration blurs boundaries, which then brings in some challenges with Conways Law, because we might be blurring those interfaces. But collaboration is really good for finding boundaries that work really well for flow. So we set the expectation that we're going to discover something over the course of, say, a few days, a few weeks, and we zoom in on what that collaboration is there to achieve. And one of the main things it's there to achieve is to find a good boundary so that one team can provide something and one team can consume something as a service. So that's our second interaction mode, X as a service. If we find a good boundary, then that is effectively friction-free. It feels really positive, it feels effortless almost to provide that service or consume that service. There's very little interaction needed at that point. And it scales really well. And then the third interaction mode is facilitating, one team helping another team to improve its capabilities or to learn something new. Collaboration and facilitating are temporary. They might only last days or weeks. Whereas X as a service, if we find a good boundary, might last many months or even years if we found a really good boundary. So we've got this dynamic, different behaviors, different interactions that are happening at the same time. We might put them together into a diagram like this, which is a snapshot of what's happening in a small part of the organization. We've got a flow of change from left to right. So that's what these diagrams all represent. They're all thinking about a flow of change. On the left is version control, something like this. And on the right-hand side is production, the live systems. And so what we're saying here is that the Streamline teams do not hand over their work to anyone else. They've got end-to-end flow of change. And this is just a snapshot because the enabling team shown in purple might be helping the Streamline team at the top at the moment. Might be facilitating them with on something, machine learning, cloud, technology, something like this. But that's only happening for a short period of time, a few days, few weeks, something like that. In the future, this diagram will look different because our enabling team will not be helping that team. They'll be somewhere else. And so on. So we can start to think about relationships between teams over time using diagrams like this and the Team Topologies principles. And that really helps us think about capabilities. It helps us think about evolving our architecture, evolving our products. I just want to mention one key aspect that Team Topologies that we've been working with a lot with our customers over the last few years is to think about dependencies in terms of blocking versus non-blocking. So traditionally, we might have had a situation where a team is working on some stuff but they have to hand it to another team like compliance or security or performance or something like that. And they have to wait for that team to finish some work before we can move that thing and deploy it to production. And what we clearly need to move towards, if we're thinking about flow, is a model where we aim to have things that are non-blocking. So we provide that compliance check or that security check or that performance check as a service from something like a platform, so that our flow of change is not blocked. We're not waiting on another team. We can just call into the service, have that compliance check pass or fail. And then obviously, if it's passed, we can deploy that thing to production. So this is a very flow-oriented way of thinking, removing barriers to flow, removing these handoffs and approval gates, and replace these with self-service API. The people who have that compliance knowledge, we're still using that, all of that awareness to create some kind of self-service compliance services, APIs, and so on. So a big mindset in compliance shifting from permitting to enabling. And this is a real door opener, really, for more effective ways of working, more flow-oriented ways of working. Effectively, you're asking this question: what would be needed for us to be compliant with security, finance, PII, whatever, with multiple decoupled rapid flows of change? And the main answer to this is self-service APIs that are defined with the people with this compliance expertise. Going back to this diagram again that we had before, you might have domain experts for compliance or governance sitting inside an enabling team, shown there at the top right. You might also have some of that expertise helping to define like a compliance as code API, shown at the bottom left. Okay, there are just a few ideas about getting started with Team Topologies before we move on. I'm not going to look at everything, but I'm just going to mention one or two things here that we've been using with some of our customers over the last couple of years. It's worthwhile thinking about what kind of teams you currently have and what their remit and mission is. Think about how these might map to the 4 different types of team that we define in Team Topologies. The mapping will not be perfect initially. Some teams will have multiple missions initially. You'll have to maybe change the focus of some of the teams to make them fit into this model, and that's a good thing. Think about cognitive load. Think about limiting the team cognitive load. And there's lots of angles to this. Some of it is about keeping the team together for a longer time, helping them to build that trust. Some of it is about aligning the team to one or more services rather than allowing them to work on all sorts of things. Some of this is about reducing the size of thing, subsystem, or service or component that team works on so they can properly own it, look after it. We might need some kind of underlying platform to reduce some of the cognitive load. We might also need to break some larger system monoliths, if you like, into smaller pieces. We might also need to think about what sometimes called reverse Conway maneuver, where if we know we need a different software architecture, we change the shape of the teams ahead of time. It's not an easy maneuver. It's not an easy thing to do. It creates some friction quite naturally because we suddenly have a mismatch between the communication patterns and the architecture. But if we're willing to take that on board and to see it through, that can be an effective way to help with this. Then think about the different interaction modes that we just mentioned: collaboration, X as a service, and facilitating. What would it take if teams were to start using these on a daily basis and thinking about the interactions that they're expecting? It can actually really provide some real benefits just early on by using this kind of technique, because we're now thinking about expectations of other teams and diffusing conflict by recognizing that we've got different expectations, and actually then starting to limit some of the ways in which teams are expected to interact to the kinds of interactions that are valuable for the kind of product and architecture that we're working on. Is another step. This kind of step seems strange to some people. We're limiting communication, but actually ends up being a good thing. We're being much more purposeful about the kind of communication we've got in place. Some architectures are not suitable for a flow-based approach, so we're looking to avoid those. We're looking to retire the older technology that don't work with this flow-based approach as well. And we can start to then use different aspects of our organization to sense our environment, our internal environment, and the business environment that we're working in. Frontline IT support people traditionally were often in some organizations not seen as particularly important. Actually, they are almost like the antenna, like an insect antenna. They are the frontline staff listening to all of the problems in the organization. Treat them like a kind of antenna, treat that as really valuable sensory input into the organization, so we can better respond to our customers. This is using kind of cybernetic principles to help us self-steer the organization. All of this material then is also available in a separate infographic. If you head to teamtopologies.com/getting-started, you'll find that online there. So you can download that and refer to it later. And that is a super quick overview of Team Topologies. I'm going to hand over to Shawn to take you through how Docker engineering used Team Topologies over the last couple of years.
Great. Thanks, Matthew. So again, I'm Shawn Axsom. I'm the Director of Engineering at Docker, and we'll be covering a little bit about our implementation before we open it up for some Q&A. So again, we've implemented Team Topologies. I'll go over the timeline for our implementation that started in April of last year, and actually talk a little bit about the differences in our history prior to implementing Team Topologies as well. So the journey into Team Topologies, it's really been impactful on myself. I started in September of 2020, around that first milestone there. At that time, that was not too long after 2019, in November 2019, whenever we sold part of our Enterprise Edition solution to Mirantis. With that, we saw opportunity to change our culture. We saw opportunity to change the ways of working. Part of that was that we were a smaller company at Series A size, but part of it was to rethink where we've been and do things better going forward. We didn't happen to know about Team Topologies yet at the time. We formed our teams around products like Docker Hub and Docker Desktop. With that, we were fairly siloed. I'll talk about a little bit of the downsides, and Matthew's already covered a lot of those issues that we had seen at the time. We were also operating very differently as far as not having cross-functional teams, and we didn't have dedicated product managers. We had product managers that floated between the different products. It was a better culture, but I wouldn't say that it was a better process that we had at the time and a better organizational structure. So that dotted line there represents where we transitioned to adopting Team Topologies 2021 and 2022. And before jumping into those aspects, I'll cover a little bit about our adoption prior to adoption. In 2020, we had different product teams that literally were centralized around the products. So there was a Docker Hub US team for the longest time. And then we had a Docker Hub EU team. We didn't even have a differentiation between those two teams. We actually had product managers that would come up with new product features or experiments we wanted to try out, and they would create feature teams out of one or more of these product teams. So we found it was very inefficient. There was less focus on the long term of certain parts of our domain, let alone our products, without dedicated PMs. And overall, it became pretty difficult to juggle even at a small scale. We knew that we needed to change, not just to scale and grow in the future, but even just handling day-to-day problems at that company size. So at that time, we were siloed a little bit more by product. Often that meant, like with what Matthew has shown, we'd have dependencies. If we want to change how accounts worked on both Docker Hub and Docker Desktop, you'd have to go to both product teams. You'd have to talk and try to get dependencies lined up, kind of get the roadmap kind of in sync between the two and get resourcing at the right moment. And one team couldn't operate independently across their domains. Even if we had dedicated PMs at the time too, then it'd be difficult to have kind of a cohesive 3-year vision even of what that domain of our product as a whole, our product set, really would look like. We were also unable to ship workflows independently. We lacked documentation for existing APIs and extension points. We had many other parts of focus that we needed to address as well. And ultimately, we weren't just siloed into products and product teams. We were even siloed based on the individuals in those teams. We had a lot of, so to speak, one-person armies. We had a lot of people that not just the teams were siloed by a product, but we were running thin, and we had maybe one person that was specialized in billing in Docker Hub, for example. and we really needed to expand beyond the siloing that we're experiencing. So at the time, again, we had Docker Hub US and EU teams. We had teams focused on Docker Desktop and Engine as well. We did have some teams that were a little bit more focused on enabling teams in some manner, but they weren't the same that we see today. So jump to 2021. Whenever we first read about Team Topologies as a leadership team, gave us a lot of new ideas for how we needed to grow. And we were starting to experience some growth at the time. Our first target was with Streamlined and enabling teams. So around leading up to April 2021, we planned on the new structure that kind of matched our 1-year strategy and our vision and what customer features we wanted to deliver. Again, looking back at what Matthew has shown, then we focused primarily on Streamline Teams. So focusing on what customers' features they wanted the most, and enabling teams. So what support they needed from infrastructure, from data analysis, and different teams like that. We wanted these teams to be a little bit more autonomous than they were in the past too. Part of that was dedicating a product manager and a designer and having a certain mission in mind. So my team was the accounts and growth team. We had the mission of the customer, be able to better organize as a customer, be able to better self-service as a customer, and be able to have more cohesive organizations on Docker Hub and across Docker products, therefore. We also wanted these teams to be customer facing. So these teams to be servicing our audience. Platform teams are important, but we knew that we first had some work to do to deliver on some promises and some features we had in mind for customers. And ultimately, again, a big battle of ours was to lower the cognitive load of the teams, having, for example, a Docker Hub US and a Docker Hub EU team that weren't entirely differentiated by a stream. We had a lot of cognitive load where individuals were siloed and the team as a whole was spread thin, because even though we had some separation in projects, both the US team and the European team had to really memorize, really understand Docker Hub as a whole and not really specialize their knowledge as much and be able to separate the concerns. So moving on to a phase 1 of the rollout of the implementation of Team Topologies. This is what it looked like. This is actually from the slide deck that we rolled out, how we had more of the Streamline teams at the top, and we had enabling teams there towards the bottom. You'll see that we no longer were separated by products. We were separated by different concerns, features that the customer needs. So be able to manage your accounts or your organization on Docker Hub and across the Docker products, having a deep focus within the registry and expanding on that feature set, be able to explore new collaboration features and new ways to improve on our content and our programs that we offer for official images and publishers. So we had a little bit more focus on the customer and the customer's needs versus being separated by those products. And so this is what the implementation looks like for phase 2. We went from phase 1 being focusing on the Streamline enabling teams, and then we started to focus more this year on the platform teams. Phase 2 goals. In phase 1, we really did deliver some features that customers really wanted and needed. And we also were able to monetize and therefore grow and reinvest in the company in a way that we are able to now invest in platform teams that would help with the scalability and the scale as a company in building out more features. So we wanted to support our Streamline teams. The Streamline teams no longer had to worry about doing platform work on the side. And we also found new fracture planes too within the Streamline teams to find what teams are a little bit overloaded and separate them out to 2 or more teams. We also developed a new company strategy for the year, and we had a new focus for our 3-year vision of what we want to enable for our customers and unlock as an organization. for our products. This is the overview of what we're transitioning to now. So you see it's a lot more complex than the previous model that we had because we are growing significantly. And we're also looking to have those platform teams that will support across their own groups that we now have, and even helping groups across directors. So we have a front-end platform team now, for example, that is looking at better improving the architecture of the front end, be able to support the teams that are developing our front ends, and even looking across products at the consistency between Docker Hub and Docker Desktop, for example. So we've built out these teams now that can help us to grow, help us to better onboard new employees as we're hiring, and help us to also sustain the growth and have more scalability and SLAs and such for our customers. Zooming in on one of those teams, just to give you a closer look, this customer group is the group that I'm directing. So we've got 5 teams here, and we have these enabling teams in purple that are helping to service them. We have more cross-functional nature now, so that these enabling teams are actually embedded as resources on these teams. They might be moved around later as needs change, and they'll have centralized manager that is their dotted line reporting to our teams, but then they will have some cohesiveness with a manager that will support them. But we have a little bit more collaboration and alignment with those enabling teams that we had in the start too. And looking at how we form these teams as well, lastly, so we've created these mission statements. This is a short snippet of it, but we ultimately defined the boundaries between the teams with certain missions that serve the customer or serve the platform that we needed to support. We also described some of the details about why we were changing certain teams and what the change in direction is for those teams. Similarly, with the platform team, we are able to look at introducing these teams and how they might service their communities of practice, so to speak, within the organization, and what might their main focuses be in improving that platform in the short term and the long term as well. So again, it's been a real journey. Moving into Team Topologies approach was very different and has shown a lot of benefits already for our organization. We're continuing to implement it and grow this year. We're looking at doubling in size as a company, and with that, this new organizational structure will really help to propel that growth. But that's it for the slide decks. We will move on to a Q&A with Matthew as well here.
That's really, really great detail, Shawn. Thank you so much. It's really great to hear, someone like you talk about this from direct experience. One of the things that really stood out for me there was the fact that you decided to start without platform teams. And this is something that we talk about in the book, and it sounds very strange to lots of people because lots of people come from a historical perspective where you've got to have a platform, you've got to have this blah, 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 you've got to have someone doing this and someone doing that. And actually taking the discipline to say, let's not assume what we need. Let's see how far we can get with Streamline Teams and use the cognitive load and flow to drive our decisions about platform. What in practice, what kind of things what kind of insights did that give you? What kind of things did it help to provide, or what kind of perspective did that give you as a leadership team and as an organization as a whole when you held back from platforms initially?
One thing was that at Docker, we're making developer tools. We are engineers and we're making tools for engineers. So the tendency to be creating tools even for yourself is very high among our engineers. And as the company was trying to be more aligned with our businesses, we wanted to make sure that engineers felt the fact that they need to be working for someone external and not just ourselves. So that was also something to make sure that it was a forcing function for our culture to be more towards our customers more than ourselves. Again,
so more customer centric because you've got these streamlined teams in place.
Yeah. So if every team shouldn't be serving ourselves or themselves, they should be serving someone external. So we set up some personas and we assign some of them to every teams. And again, don't forget Docker publishing developer tooling. In a nutshell, you could also say, like, in an extreme way, you can say, oh, I'm just creating tool for myself. Like, I'm an engineer. So why shouldn't Docker be serving myself? So that was also a way for policing ourselves into being external. And we know our engineers, right? So we know also our own flows as a leadership team. So we knew that if we were starting with this, it would basically slow down or would not get all the benefits of getting there. It has been fairly successful. I can't tell you how many conversations I had with some engineers knocking on my virtual door saying, hey, whenever we do platform team, can I be part of it? Because everybody was like, yeah, trying to get back to that normal things in a sense. Shawn, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I'd say really focusing on the customer. One of our virtues is developer obsession, and that's really focusing on the customer's needs. Platform teams are essential for scaling and servicing that long term, but short term, we did know that we had certain things customers were asking for. We had certain things on the roadmap that we knew that we had to and wanted to deliver in the short term. So with that, we developed the right features. We were able to also grow a little bit as a company at that time. And that also helps to reinvest in the company too. And it helps to get that scale that platform teams are really essential for too.
So we've talked through the need for this customer orientation, and Streamline Teams were a key part of that. But what other considerations did you have when rolling out some of these ideas from Team Topologies? What other kind of things were you thinking about?
I think the most difficult part, was trying to understand what was the cognitive load of every team. Basically, when you come from a product-oriented organization, we call this internally shipping the org charts, which basically means whatever product you are, you can define. If you know the number of products that the company does, then you know how it's organized. It's like a Conways Law. So we were coming from this, and we wanted to be. Basically, we wanted to cut those teams, product teams, into Streamline team. How do we do this? So we follow what's the book, which is about the cognitive load, which is really something that appeal to looking at how an engineer is actually working at the team level, of course. But is the team overloaded? Why? And then you start looking into that direction. And so we're looking at, I don't know, number of repos, number of phone calls, alerts, number of services, these things. And that's how we started creating the boundaries between the teams, or at least in the first shot that Shawn described, we aimed for something, but honestly, we didn't really know what we were doing because we were trying to get things without actually live through it. And that's why step 2 that Shawn also described is more like learning from all the things to understand, we still have teams who were overloaded, that have too high cognitive load, despite the fact that we wanted to avoid this. So we learned along the way how to do this a bit better. And this year of running the first step, I think, was really a learning experience for everybody to try to understand how to get that better. We also were in a spot where we're growing the company, right? So it was easy to actually spot some teams were having some too high cognitive load and say, okay, we need to address this. So wherever this team is, can we make 2? Can we make 2.5, 3, or something like that? We have this opportunity to do so. That's something that I don't think you can apply everywhere, right? If you're in a closed number of people, a number of teams, then it might be harder, but we had this opportunity at least.
Say that we also focusing back on the customer a little bit, but really on the development process. Whenever you silo by products, then it's kind of Conway's Law there, where you start to develop systems that are siloed themselves based on the different teams that you have. And with that, we want to have more integration. We want to have a really good, seamless experience for our customers. And if we want to add some features like single sign-on that we've added recently, we want to be able to have one team that has a cohesive vision of what that experience is going to look like. So we want to be able to have a single sign-on experience that is on Docker Hub that allows you to have the same look and feel, the same integration with Docker Desktop that as you'd expect on other feature sets within Docker Hub.
I think one way that we talked about, one of the consideration we had was also the book, which is really great at trying to spotlight the fact that cognitive load is very important, right? Because it's something sometimes which is like really hard to estimate. I know like some people are producing, story points to understand how much they're doing and then comparing this with whatever they were doing before, something to have a sense of this, or counting number of bugs or tickets or whatever. We don't do this kind of things here at Docker, but what we learned by starting to look at cognitive load was caring for the people inside, right? So we were caring for the team as the unit of work, and do they have enough people? Do they have the necessary skill? Why are they struggling? And the fact that you are looking at this cognitive load is really great, because you can make a direct relationship between the fact that you're busy in your head and the fact that you can't ship stuff. So by basically trying to, I would say at the human level, right? It's like at some point you look at the people inside the team and you say, okay, what can I do for them to have like less burden in a sense, right?
And this is a very deliberate thing that we wanted to do with Team Topologies. Is we Manuel and I, when we were working with different customer organizations, we saw people who were overloaded, but they were frustrated, that they found it very, very difficult to do the work for lots of reasons. And clearly, it's not just about how many story points you're shipping in a month. And most of the cognitive load probably comes from somewhere else. It doesn't even come from the kind of regular feature work. It comes from the environment in which you're working. Wanting to make an improvement to people's everyday lives effectively, and actually zooming in on cognitive load seems like a very positive thing for lots of organizations and lots of individuals and teams inside organizations. Does it feel like that's had a positive effect within Docker engineering?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think you were talking about like estimating this. So story points might not be the right way. I think like what we're looking at is the number of services, for instance, that people had. And when there is an issue with one of those services, we were looking at how long does it take to fix it. Do people know that right away? Or do they need to say, oh, I've seen this once and I need to look at some notebook or notes that we left on Notion somewhere to try to understand how it works. And you feel like, all right, so actually you don't exactly know what you're managing. So that probably is a hint that this team has too much cognitive load, because there are some services that they're responsible for that they can't fix right away. And this is the kind of skill that Shawn and myself start to learn, to detect when a team has too much stuff. And then you decide.
There's multiple different kinds of cognitive load, right? There's cognitive load about the domain itself, like the concepts around the thing that you're trying to work with. There's cognitive load around the tools that you're using to get this thing shipped. There's then cognitive load around diagnosing an incident or a production. Multiple different sources of cognitive load. And you can't just focus on one. You've got to think holistically for that team. If that team is going to really be responsible for that whole service that they're providing, then we've really got to put ourselves in that team's shoes, in the shoes of that team, and go, actually, yeah, if there's all these things they've got to do, if the experience of using this tool is really bad, that's not going to help them to look after that service. It's not going to help them do their best work. So let's deal with that aspect. So what does all this mean? If you think about a typical engineer who's working inside Docker engineering, what does this mean for a typical engineer? Like on a day-to-day basis, if they're working there prior to the changes in 2020, before 2019, and they've gone through this transition period, how is their life, day-to-day life, going to feel different?
We've made substantial changes since then. So we've changed this to Streamline Teams, platform teams. With the Streamline Teams, you feel supported more. With the platform teams, there to help the platform teams, we have recurring syncs, and the Streamline Teams let the platform teams know their pain points and get things improved. Before, we were focused on individual company or individual teams' tech debt and architecture, but now we have a more supportive model, and we have other teams that are there to help. There's a lot more collaboration than we used to have. As an individual, that helps to see that improvement in the code base and the technical side, but also back to the missions that we have. These missions are the most critical for the company's strategy and for the customer. And it's been really insightful and empowering as an engineer whenever I came on board, and now as a director, to have some long-term focus and some understanding of how that impacts the customer.
I think that's a really key idea. There's definitely some approaches to software development that maybe came about 20 years ago or something like this, that for whom the main thing is to be able to switch from one part of the code base to another. And that might be fine for 20 years ago, when the code bases the technology was much more simple. And the domains, the business domains were much simpler. We did not have to, there were fewer domains to think about. But the idea of being able to switch from multiple domains across an entire business suite these days, and potentially switching different technologies, seems unrealistic. So being able to zoom in and become really engaged in one particular area, at least for a year or two or three, before moving on to something else, the ability to zoom in and really get to know our customers in that space seems to be really engaging for lots of people.
We changed from 2019 was the fact that since Streamline needs to be, again, like the diagram that you've shown with the flow is pretty important because it means that you go from the start of the inception of the idea to actually whenever you ship it. So we basically, while we're doing this team topologies change, we also introduce with every team a product manager, which is dedicated to the team, and a UX designer. That's part of making the teams autonomous. They don't need to rely on an external source of people to actually have their work. So they're autonomous, they know how to ship things by themselves. That's also playing a big part into the success of the Streamline team, because then they're independent and autonomous into shipping their things. And some teams, as you said, they need more skills into front-end engineering, for instance, more back-end kind of things, or more in some teams at Docker, we do system level programming. And so not all the teams are the same, but what the book is telling you also, and I think it's the first chapter, you talk about thinking as the team as the unit of work. And then when you start looking at this and you forget not about the individuals in themselves, but actually not thinking about them as the unit of work, then it starts getting simpler, because you basically think about the team as like, that is the team able to actually fulfill the objective that they have. And then you just had the people, you move the people around, or the skills, or you train people to actually get them what they need. So that's also a big part of the change there.
And one part this comes into play heavily too is with hiring. I've been very involved with talking to people on coffee chats and such, trying to find not just people that have the certain technology background that we need, but also looking at people from a whole new dimension. People that have non-traditional backgrounds can often be good for teams like our billing team. People that have worked heavily in finance, for example, it's a new dimension where they have not just strong interest in Docker and our technologies that we use, but also looking at it from a domain perspective and seeing what they're most passionate about outside technology as well.
We've talked in length about Docker, but maybe Matthew, you can also shed some light on what kind of organization you're helping, because like, okay, Docker is really a tech company, and then maybe it's successful for us. It doesn't work. Does it work only for?
It certainly works for plenty of tech companies. We've been working with plenty of technology companies, but we've also been working with a whole range of other companies. Financial companies, banks, retail, wholesale, insurance, defense and aerospace, you name it, basically government as well. Been doing a lot of work with the government in Norway and the government in Canada recently. We know that quite a few departments in the UK government have been starting to adopt some of the Team Topologies ideas and so on. And in pretty much every geography as well. We know that Team Topologies has a lot of excitement in Japan at the moment, after the Japanese translation of the Team Topologies book was published, I think, last year. And lots of interest in different parts of the world, different sectors and so on. I think it's fair to say that literally on the front cover of the book, it's the subtitle is, Team Topologies, Organizing Business and Technology Teams for Fast Flow. The context for Team Topologies to work is where we need a fast flow of change. There will be some contexts where that's not relevant. We think that maybe like research and development, like engineering R&D or science R&D, maybe it's not quite the right place. At least not all the ideas. Some of the ideas would definitely still work, because we know we've had people tell us that the ideas are valuable, but there might be some areas like that where the focus is not fast flow of change, the focus is on kind of discovery and refinement and things, which is fine. But certainly for lots of organizations where we can and need a fast flow of change, and then the idea seems to be really helpful. I think it's fair to say that organizations need to expect to help their people to learn. They need to expect to build a learning organization to make any of this kind of stuff work, not just Team Topologies, but any approaches like this, where we're expecting to empower teams to make decisions and to be somewhat autonomous. We need to have a kind of learning culture in the organization. We've definitely worked with a couple of organizations where they read the Team Topologies book and they thought, oh, it's just about arranging some new kind of types of team and putting those in place. And that's it. So basically they read a couple of chapters and then didn't read the really important stuff in towards the middle of the book and the end of the book about evolving the organizations and kind of empowering teams to listen for important signals. So it's really great to hear the kind of emphasis that you're putting on learning and empowering teams to be autonomous and substantially independent. That's a really big kind of foundation for success in anything like this kind of space. So that's really good to hear.
So the Docker engineering has been, I don't know, the book has been published, I don't know, 6 months or 8 months before we have to go through that change. So basically, we pick up the book, we share it among ourselves, and we say, that sounds like good. Do you want to work on that? That's where our journey towards it. And because we were at the time really looking for, I don't know, a structure on help or some inspiration to actually guide our change from the shipping the org charts to the next thing. But I guess not everybody does the same thing as we do. So what are the first steps that other companies are actually taking to actually embrace Team Topologies?
We are, as Team Topologies, we're working a more comprehensive approach to assessing team cognitive load at scale. Working on that during 2022. There'll be something later this year. Fingers crossed, we'll have that out. More fundamentally, though, as you said, if an organization is in a situation where one team has got 75 services to look after, then just start there. Start with just a pure number of services that teams are expected to look after, because that's not sustainable in itself. Unless they are almost trivial, unless most of those services work in almost the same way, then having to think about 75 different services is going to almost certainly exceed the team cognitive load. So there could well be some fairly simple things to think about like that. Just counting the number of things that teams are responsible for is probably a good place to start, and kind of framing discussions based around cognitive load. Well, what happens if we have exceeded the team cognitive load over here? That would be awkward. That would mean that they can't really focus properly on that thing. They're probably ignoring some of the problems. They're not able to fix those problems in production quickly enough, and so on. And it maps directly back to kind of risk and uptime and customer satisfaction, things like this. So there's work to do in that space, which is actually pretty straightforward. You can drive quite a lot from thinking about team cognitive load effectively. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that a lot of organizations ask us about is that they ask this question. They ask a question something like this: how do we find good boundaries? How do we find good team boundaries and architectural boundaries for a fast flow of change? It's a really important question. And ultimately, there are some well-established techniques like domain-driven design, DDD. We've also come up with some techniques which are a little bit more easy to get started with. One of the techniques is called independent service heuristics. If you search for that, you'll find it online, or you can go to teamtopologies.com/ISH, and that'll get you an article which we published recently. And we're developing this as we go along, but we wanted to find a technique which helps non-technical people and technical people. So people from a non-engineering background, like product or sales or marketing or whatever, together with people from a more of an engineering background, to work together, discuss things together, and discover where some effective boundaries are based on what the business actually needs. And so we wanted to, and we've been using this approach, and it seems to be quite successful in bringing people together in a way which helps different perspectives to be brought to the surface. And so we're finding boundaries that are based on multiple different sets of knowledge about how the business actually works. And that's really key, because if we get the wrong kind of boundaries in place, the boundaries that are not really aligned to the natural flow of change in the business, then we're going to be fighting against that. And so finding some techniques like independent service heuristics that help us to find these good flows of change is a really important kind of early step in this kind of approach.
And I know that you've published also a follow-up to the original book. I admit I haven't read it yet, but maybe you can talk about it real quick, Matthew.
Yes. So the new book is called Remote Team Interactions Workbook, and it's effectively applying the ideas in Team Topologies to a remote first context. Because when we wrote the book, it was pre-pandemic. Now, actually, it turns out that pretty much all of the principles and ideas in Team Topologies book do actually apply really well in the remote first context, but we've got to change the examples that we use. It's a workbook. It's published by IT Revolution, the same publishers as Team. The print version is coming out in April in the US, and I think May in the rest of the world. The delay is due to shipping and things. There's literally a container ship stuck somewhere in the South China Sea with lots of rolls of paper and printer ink. And it literally took months to get to the US. So this is an example of where containers are not really helping or something like this anyway. But most of the time, containers are great, right? Docker's done an amazing job, but yes, in the physical world, there's been some challenges with worldwide shipping, whatever. Anyway, so that remote team interactions workbook will be out in print very soon in the next few weeks. It's available right now from the IT Revolution app. The publisher has their own app. And the idea of the book is that it's very much, we call it a workbook because we're taking the ideas, but then we're saying, hey, So here's some kind of theory, if you like, or some principles. Here's an example. Now go and try this yourself. So go and try and implement this stuff in your organization in a remote first context. So it's like an extension effectively to the Team Topologies book. And so far, people have found it really useful. There's no real rocket science in there. It's not magical. It's just, let's try and define some things better. Let's use some shared language. Let's make sure our Slack channels are named in a sensible way that allows us to discover information rather than guess. Things like this, which seem really obvious after you've read it, but lots of organizations are not taking any of this kind of advice on board. We wanted to put that together as a kind of interim step. We felt we owed it to people who have been struggling with this kind of remote first pandemic to help explain how Team Topologies can help in lots of these contexts.
So we definitely need to read it, Shawn. I think we are Docker now a remote first company, and we sold our offices, and we are not planning to get any back any soon. Okay. And I definitely have been one annoying people renaming the channel in Slack to make them more understandable and everything. And I know that Shawn also is like helping on that every now and then. So definitely this is something that could match for us. We're almost at time. So I don't know, Shawn, you want to say something at the end, and then maybe Matthew can close after that?
So Matthew, besides what you've mentioned, some great resources and your upcoming book, are there other, I think you've mentioned some workshops and such that people might be able to participate in? How else might people have opportunity to get started?
So if you just go to our website, teamtopologies.com, you'll find a whole bunch of resources. We've got lots of stuff that's available for free, Creative Commons, open source, that kind of thing. Talks, slides, and we try and put as much stuff online. We've got an open template library, Shapes template library, which you've seen in the slides that you put together, Shawn. So thank you for using those. But that's free and open to use. We want people to create diagrams using that and send us pull requests for improving the diagram style and that kind of thing. We've got the infographics that I mentioned in my talk. We actually have an online academy. If you go to academy.teamtopologies.com, you'll find that. So we've got one particular training course that is going to be quite appealing, I think, to many people on this watching this talk now, is the Platform as a Product course that we've got there, which is focused on how you go about creating a modern kind of internal platform that actually really works in the context of fast flow. And so applying product thinking to this internal platform, which for many people in that space, it is quite new. And we've got other courses coming over the next few months as well. We've also got some workshops and multi-week programs where we've worked more directly with people, remote but live. And many of those workshops are really effective. They're bringing people together, they're helping people to discuss and share perspectives and help to accelerate and point things in the right direction and accelerate the changes towards a Team Topologies, a flow-oriented approach inside an organization. If you head to our website, teamtopologies.com, you'll find out more from there.
I'll highlight one other thing you'll find on teamtopologies.org is the examples section. So you've given quite a few great examples of organizations that have implemented Team Topologies besides us. And with that, by the time of this recording being shared at DockerCon, then we should have a case study of Docker expanding on what you've heard today as well.
Yeah, we're looking forward to having that, the case study from Docker published on our website. That will be at teamtopologies.com/examples.
All right, so I think we can wrap up now. So I think we tried to cover Team Topologies, how it has been applied there. We try to give you like a lot of different directions so you can apply this at your company. And of course, if you want to participate into this change internally at Docker, Shawn's team is hiring. So if you want to work with Shawn or others, you know how to reach us. And I want to really thank you, Shawn and Matthew, for being with me today and then sharing all your knowledge there. We're eager to see your questions and answering them into the chat now. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.